Chapter 8 24th of March Outskirts of Kiev. Alexei continued making deliveries of important supplies along with several other people over the last few days. Now his friend Dmitro was no longer keeping him company. After stepping on an explosive, Dmitro was taken to a hospital to be treated for severe injuries and burns. His life was saved, but unfortunately his left leg could not be saved. It was emotionally difficult. Alexei suspected that Dmitro would have to stay in the hospital for the next few days at least. He knew he'd need to check up on his best friend in a few days and to give him some moral support. For now, he had to do his part in helping the people in recently liberated territories, as well as to the soldiers who were fighting very close to the front line. At times he was even asked to repair a few things, as his skill at repairing vehicles came very useful. It was a morning time, and Alexei was in a settlement that was liberated only a day ago. Some Ukrainian soldiers were still patrolling the streets. He, along with a few other people, were among the first to bring in supplies and humanitarian aid. His new canine friend, Max, was sticking close to him at all times. Shortly after Dmitro was taken to a hospital, Alexei found out that the dog's owners had been killed only a few days ago, and the dog was left on its own. Alexei spent the next hour delivering the supplies to civilians. As he delivered yet another package of food to people in one of the houses along a quiet road, he began proceeding to the next house when he noticed Max stopped following him and turned away somewhere. "What is it, Max?" he asked. The dog continued looking somewhere out beyond the houses and into a wooded area. Then, after a few more seconds, he barked to get Alexei's attention and ran in the direction of the woods. "Max, wait! Where are you going?" Alexei couldn't understand why Max suddenly ran towards the woods, but he decided to follow. Perhaps something of importance was there. Max continued producing a barking noise after every few steps to make sure Alexei was following him. Alexei ran at the fastest pace he possibly could whilst carrying a bag full of supplies. Once they were inside the wooded area, it was more difficult for Alexei to see Max up ahead. The trees weren't so dense at first, but as they ventured deeper, the trees and other plants got closer together, and it was to some degree darker there too. Alexei had to dodge lots of prickly shrubs by either side of the path, and could hear dry twigs crunching beneath his feet as he continued running after his dog. A few small hanging branches slapped his face on the way too, as the path was rather narrow in places. Max finally stopped whilst looking someplace to the right. Alexei reached him, trying to catch his breath, and feeling like all the blood in his body had begun to swirl around in a frenzy. He then heard something and turned in the direction Max was facing. A little girl was in the distance, running this way towards them and yelling for help. Alexei waited not a second more, and ran to see what was going on. Max ran right after him, barking along the way. The girl saw them and stopped, looking relieved. "Hey, are you alright?" Alexei asked as soon as he reached her. "I need some help. My mom is not getting up," the girl said while shedding tears. "Where is she?" "This way." The girl began running back to where she came from, with Alexei and Max following her. They didn't need to travel far, as very soon they came across a patch of trees and shrubs arranged in a sort of semicircle. A woman was laying next to one of the trees. Alexei rushed to the woman's side. The woman was alive, but she looked very poorly. Her fair hair was laying on top of most of her face, and she was wrapped up in a warm coat. The little girl sat down beside her mother. "She needs help. Please help her," the girl begged. "She's got a fever," Alexei said whilst touching the woman's forehead and noticing that it was very hot. "We should take her to a hospital." "Will she be alright?" "I hope so," Alexei said optimistically, even though he did not know if the illness was serious or not. He tried to pick the woman up, but all of a sudden she swung her eyes open and grabbed him by the collar. This startled Alexei and almost made him jump back. "It's okay," he said. "I'm here to help you." The woman continued looking at him for a few more seconds, and then loosened her grasp of his collar and closed her eyes. Alexei picked her up in his arms and was ready to carry her back to the settlement. He began heading back through the forest path, with the girl walking by his side and Max on the other side. "What's your name?" Alexei asked the little girl as they continued walking. "Alina, and my mom's name is Maria. What's yours?" "Alexei." "I knew a boy in school who had that name too." "Where do you and your mom live? How did you end up here in the woods? We walked for 3 days from Bucha. Lots of bad soldiers there. They killed many people. They killed my dad. They also killed Georgi. He was helping us. Oleksiy could see that Alina was very sad when talking about this topic. She and her mother were in the occupied territory for some time and must have seen a lot of horrible things. For a small child like this to lose her father, no doubt was traumatizing. Oleksiy realized that her pain must have been even worse than the pain he felt when his father died in Donbass. Everything will be okay now, he said to Alina after a few seconds of thought. There are no Russian soldiers here, so they won't hurt you here. Did they try to come here too? They were here, yes. Our soldiers forced them out of here a day or two ago. They won't come back. Alina nodded, showing that she understood everything. They continued along the path for some time. Oleksiy could roughly remember the direction he and Max came from and kept backtracking. His arms were getting a bit sore now, as he was still carrying Maria in his arms. Having a supply bag hanging on his back too was making him feel somewhat exhausted. Nevertheless, he pressed on and intended to get Maria some medical help. After a few more minutes, they could see the end of the woods ahead and some houses just beyond. The path seemed a lot longer on the way back, but they finally made it. Now they needed to find someone who could take Maria and Alina to a hospital. 25th of March, Mykolaiv. With a tray full of food, Solomia entered the room where Zlata was. Solomia spent many hours the last 2 days with the girl, trying to tend to all her needs and making sure she continued recovering. Zlata was very distressed the entire time, frequently looking at where her left arm used to be, trying to get used to it, and also occasionally asking if her parents were okay. Solomia set the tray of food down next to the girl's bed and sat down on a chair beside it. Zlata looked at the tray and grabbed a bowl with soup that was in it and then a piece of bread too. After 2 days of barely eating, it seemed Zlata's appetite had returned. To Solomia, this looked like a positive sign. Let me know if there's anything else you'd like me to bring, Solomia spoke, trying to start a conversation. I'm fine, thank you. This stuff is good enough. Do you want me to put something on the TV for you? No, that's okay. I don't really have an interest to watch anything. I don't watch much TV anyway. What do you like to do then? I like to read about interesting things online. Things about animals, for example, especially dinosaurs. I also like to read about planets and about countries and cultures too. Wow, you have a lot of passion for learning new things. It's very interesting. The world is so huge and has so much in it. Is there a country or a city that you want to visit the most then? Zlata thought for a moment. The question seemed to have intrigued her. You know, it's hard to pick just one place, because I want to see so many places, like Venice, Paris, Egypt, or even Japan. Your dreams will come true, dear, Solomia encouraged her. This war will end, and you will see all those places. There will be better times ahead. Zlata lowered her gaze and stopped eating. By the looks of it, it was very difficult for her to accept the reality and to see what her life turned into. Her mind was likely still in a state of shock and trying gradually to adjust to the events that were happening. Solomia, can you please tell me the truth? Zlata spoke and looked directly into Solomia's eyes. About what, dear? What happened to my mom and dad? Are they still alive? Solomia was speechless and did not know what to say, and she could tell that Zlata was reading her emotions on her face. They're dead, aren't they? Zlata asked in a half-crying voice. Solomia stayed silent, not wanting to make this news sound any more sorrowful than it was already. Zlata's eyes filled with tears, and she began to cry. Solomia put her arms around the child and brought her closer to herself. Zlata burrowed her face into Solomia's shoulder and kept crying. Her right hand was clutching onto Solomia's arm, as if she was afraid to lose Solomia too. Zlata cried non-stop for almost half an hour, until eventually she got sapped of her energy and went quiet. She had no more tears to cry. She was merely leaning her head sideways into Solomia's chest and staring vacantly at the wall ahead. Solomia kept silent and simply continued holding the girl tenderly and giving her all the warmth that she needed in that moment. Solomia, have you lost anyone because of this war too? The girl's question startled Solomia. It was so sudden and so direct. Solomia did not see a reason to withhold any information. She was comfortable sharing personal details with Zlata and to build a closer bond with her. I lost my beloved man Timur. I've been in pain ever since. He was everything to me, my rock, my world, and now he's gone forever and left me by myself. And I don't know what to do anymore. I feel like I've been thrown into a violent sea storm and now have to somehow find my way back on land. Zlata raised her head and gazed Solomia in the eyes. What Solomia said touched the little girl, as she could relate to the same emotional state of loss. "Did he die while fighting the enemy?" she then asked. "Yes, in the first few days of the invasion." "Then he's a hero. He died so that you and I can live." Solomia nodded in agreement. She felt like tears were about to fall from her eyes, but she tried her best to stop them. She did not want to show herself being emotionally weak in front of the girl, but it was very hard. "We'll stick together, okay? You have me, and I have you," Solomia suggested to the girl. "Thank you," Zlata appreciated the suggestion. A thunderous noise suddenly came from outside. A missile landed somewhere in the distance. Solomia and Zlata both turned in the direction the noise came from. Then another impact was heard, closer this time. Zlata looked very scared, so Solomia stood up and embraced her tightly, making sure to cover her fully in case anything fell on her. Suddenly, a third strike occurred, landing somewhere right next to the hospital. It shook the building violently. The shockwave shattered all the windows in the room, causing Zlata to shriek in terror. The windows were all barricaded, and so none of the shards from broken windows could get into the room. Despite that, it was still a terrifying sound. Solomia felt her heart beating at an alarming speed. She was expecting another missile to hit the hospital building directly, and braced herself for any falling debris. To their relief, there were no more blasts. They waited for another minute, but it was still quiet. Solomia released Zlata, but could still see Zlata shaking in fear. The little girl was traumatized. The shock from a bomb landing in her apartment, killing her parents and leaving her disabled, continued being there, and she was getting anxious over any loud noise. "Solomia, why do they want to kill us? Why?" Zlata asked in a trembling voice. "Because they are not thinking straight. They are sick in the head and confused. People like that should be pitied," Solomia replied in the heat of the moment, although she wasn't sure herself of the answer to the girl's question. Zlata did not know what to say. She just agreed with Solomia's response, and then lay her head down on the bed. "Get some rest now, okay? I won't be far, and we'll keep checking up on you," Solomia said after a short pause and got up from her chair. "Okay, I will. Thank you for everything, Solomia. You are very kind." Solomia merely smiled back, and then headed out of the room. Once in the corridor, she wanted to check if everyone else was fine after the bombardment that had just occurred outside. A few nurses were hastily moving in the corridors, and everyone continued working and helping the patients. It seemed that most hospital staff was used to this by now. The senior nurse, Vera, was passing by at that moment and stopped by Solomia's side. "How's Zlata doing? Has she eaten anything?" "Yes, her appetite is returning. She's very vulnerable emotionally though. She figured out that her parents perished in the bombing. Poor thing. She would have had to find that out sooner or later. Please watch her closely, okay? Once she starts recovering, we might need your help with the wounded again. We keep getting more of them each day." "Okay, I understand. May I ask one more thing whilst you're here?" Solomia had an idea and she really wanted to find out what Vera would say. "Of course, what would you like to ask?" "Since Zlata has no one to live with once she's discharged, I'd like to take care of her myself. I'd like for her to live with me. She needs all the love and support she can get." If you are really sure about this, Solomia, we can try to arrange that. You'll need to sign a few official papers, and we'll need to get higher management to approve this. It could take a few days." "I understand." Vera then continued with her duties. Solomia checked a few other wards to make sure everything was in order and nobody needed any help, and then headed back to the room Zlata was in to watch over her. She knew it was the right decision to have Zlata come to live with her after being discharged. She felt it in her heart. Zlata needed someone dear nearby to help her recover emotionally, and Solomia knew that she too needed someone dear nearby. Someone she could care for. 27th of March, Kharkiv. Ksenia, Olesya and Vadim were gathered in a shelter, having a cup of tea. There was a lot of shelling happening in Kharkiv the last few days, so they had to spend a lot of their time in the shelter. Food was starting to run low again. We really need to leave the city as soon as possible. They'll bury us under the rubble if we don't, Olesia brought up the same topic they've been discussing for days now. Trouble is finding a suitable time when they're not dropping missiles on our heads. It will be dangerous, Vadim pointed out. But I agree with you, we can't stay here forever. Ksenia continued listening to them both discussing it for a minute, and then went over to a small cabinet with some books. She searched around the books until she found the map of the country. It was still in a fairly good condition, so she took it with herself, walked over to Olesia and Vadim, and set down the map on the table in front of them. Let's begin planning our road, she suggested. Yes, we should have been doing that earlier, Olesia agreed. Where would you suggest to go? Vadim asked. Kiev is still not safe. My parents live in Vinnytsia, Ksenia replied. That might be the best place for us to go for now. Olesia and Vadim both went silent and seemed to have begun considering that idea. Ksenia knew that trying to drive out of Kharkiv was still dangerous at this time, but they needed to take action soon as their supplies were running out and the city continued getting attacked every day. Alright, Vadim agreed. Let's decide on our trip. If the next couple of days prove to be relatively safe, we can begin driving out of the city then. We could stop in Poltava, Ksenia suggested and pointed on the map. It's a bit safer there and we'll be able to buy some more food for the road. Good idea, Vadim acknowledged. We might need to spend the night there before proceeding further. The three of them kept looking at the map after having decided the first stage of the journey. Vadim continued. Since the area around Kiev is still dangerous, I suggest we do not go that way. I think from Poltava it would be better to go through Kremenchuk and then Kropivnitsky, and from there it's pretty much straight towards Vinnytsia. Those places are in the central parts of the country and far from all the fighting. I think it's the safest road for us. Ksenia and Olesia continued inspecting the map and checking the route Vadim had suggested. It seemed like a reasonable road to take, and neither of them had any objections. Once they concluded, Ksenia got up and walked over to the cabinet. She wanted to start deciding on what objects could be useful to take with them for the road. Olesia joined her half a minute later. I pray to God that everything goes fine this time, Olesia said before she began looking through a neighboring cabinet. Her shoulder was noticeably better now, although she still tried not to overexert its joint. I hope for the same, responded Ksenia. The most dangerous part is getting out of Kharkiv. Once we're beyond the city, it will be easier. Poor Anton. He had so much ahead of him still. His death was so unjust. I wish we hadn't tried to leave the city that day. He would have still been alive now. I know, dear, but we can't do anything about that now. Going through what we should have done will only make you feel worse. Yeah, perhaps you're right. Olesia stopped looking in the cabinet and just sat down on the floor. Her eyes were looking down. Ksenia stopped as well for a moment and turned to her friend. She could feel that Olesia was being tormented by thoughts. How are your nightmares, by the way? Ksenia asked. The two girls discussed this topic with each other a lot in the first 2 weeks of the invasion, but in the last few days they were bringing it up less and less. Not quite as frequent as before, but I still get them from time to time. 2 nights ago I saw us all sitting in our apartment when some soldiers burst in through the front doors and began shooting at us. I woke up very sharply from that, feeling my heart pounding hard in my chest. Couldn't fall asleep for a full hour after that. I've been plagued by similar kinds of dreams, Ksenia admitted. I just hope all this ends soon. I can't bear losing anyone else dear to me. I won't survive it. If I lose my dad, or you, my psyche will just break. Ksenia shifted herself closer to her dear friend and gently put her hands on her shoulders. You will not lose me, Olesia. I'll be close by to always support you, just as you have always supported me over the years. Olesia looked up at Ksenia and gave a feeble smile after hearing such compassionate words. She then gave Ksenia a tight hug. Olesia was in a lot of emotional pain. They all were. This pain could haunt them for a long time. There was no escaping it. The only thing they could do was to face it together and support each other. 28th of March, Mariupol. Danil and Lera were in a shelter. The situation in Mariupol continued worsening exponentially. There was now fierce fighting happening within the city, and some parts of the city had already been taken over by the enemy forces. It was inevitable that the city would fall under the enemy's control soon, and escaping it now was even harder and more dangerous than earlier in the month. Danil's hands had healed for the most part, but both he and Lera were in a terrible state. Water continued being scarce, They frequently found themselves thirsty, only having enough water to continue surviving, but not to feel their thirst fully quenched. Food was also rapidly declining. There was now none of it left in the shelter, and going out to get more was far too dangerous. Neither Daniil nor Lera had eaten anything this entire day and were both terribly hungry. Because of this, they were both feeling low on energy and unwilling to do anything other than lie on their beds and talk. There were fewer other people in the shelter now too. Only a handful of others remained. Most must have either been killed or had tried to flee the city. Death of a loved one or an acquaintance became a regular occurrence for many. "I have failed us, Lera," Daniil said bitterly whilst laying on his back and staring at the blank ceiling above him. "No, you haven't." "I have. I promised Mom and Dad that I'd look after you. I tried getting us out of the city, but it all led to nothing. I am useless." "Don't say that. You are the best brother anyone could ever ask for." "Our only choice, if we want to stay alive, is to evacuate to Russia." "No, this is not a choice. How can we trust them to treat us with any dignity? If I'm going to die, I'd rather die on my home soil and not on the territory of the enemy." Daniil desperately wanted to do everything possible so that his sister would stay alive and be out of this hell. There was no certainty with any of the choice. To stay here and die? To try fleeing and die? Or to evacuate to the territory of the enemy and get treated with humiliation? Thunderous noises of shelling were heard coming from outside again. It sounded like the missiles landed very close. Daniil and Lera were already used to this discordant sound. Hearing bombardment on a daily basis became a normality. Sounds of shelling were nothing more than just background noise at this point. And lately, because of street fighting happening, they began hearing booming noises of tank gunfire too. It only added to the disharmonic symphony of impending doom. For a brief moment, both of them heard the shelter door opening, making all the noises from outside louder for a fraction of a second, until the door was closed again. Someone just came into the shelter. Perhaps one of the other people had returned. The footsteps sounded heavy though. Daniil couldn't see who it was, as the room they were staying in was not directly facing the shelter entrance. They then heard a harsh masculine voice. "Everybody out!" Both Daniil and Lera sharply rose from their beds, their hearts pounding in terror. "It's one of them," Lera said quietly so only her brother could hear. "They're already here." "Hide," Daniil uttered to her and got up onto his feet. They could now hear the voices of other shelter dwellers next door, talking to the man that just walked in. Daniil and Lera listened in and could make out some words. They were now sure that the man that entered was the Russian soldier. The other people in the shelter began begging for the man to have some mercy, but their voices were quickly silenced by deafening gunfire. Daniil could see his sister in absolute terror. Her eyes were reflecting a sense of despondency even more now than before. The two of them scurried towards a nearby cabinet and hid behind it, hoping that the intruder would just leave. "Come out now! I know you're here!" the man yelled out loud and then entered the room they were in. Daniil could tell that the man was still standing at the doorway, and it was not possible to see the other side of the cabinet from there. So long as the man did not move any further in, he would not see them. A burst of gunfire came suddenly, making Lera abruptly gasp out loud. The intruder was clearly trying to scare them, and after Lera's gasp, there was no doubt that he had heard them. "Come out nicely and I won't shoot you," he said a second later. "He knows we're here," Lera whispered to Daniil with tears in her eyes. Daniil put a finger to his lips to gesture for her to be quiet, and then listened in to the man's actions. Footsteps resumed, now coming closer to them, louder and louder with each step. He was approaching. "You think I'm stupid?" He appeared in front of them from around the cabinet all of a sudden. Before either Daniil or Lera could react, the enemy soldier grabbed Daniil by the shoulder with one of his hands and pulled him roughly. On a normal day, Daniil would have managed to withstand such pull, but because he was hungry and sapped of energy, he felt his legs give way and he fell face forward to the floor. When he turned to look up at the man, he saw the man grabbing and pushing Lera onto the ground too. She was now crying in full and asking him to stop. Daniil tried to get back up onto his feet and to protect his sister, but the soldier walked up to him and kicked him hard in the chest, sending him tumbling backwards with force. "No! Leave my brother alone!" Lara shouted and grabbed the soldier by the right leg with both of her hands, trying her best to stop him from moving. The soldier turned his head towards her with an annoyed expression on her face and struck her on the back with the butt of his rifle. She cried from the sharp pain and let go of his leg while still crawling on the floor. Daniil looked hastily around, hoping to use something to fight back against the cruel and sadistic invader. His eyes stopped on something, a shovel. He reached out and grabbed it tightly with both hands. A bout of strength came to him and he rose up. The soldier was still looking down at Lara and began turning in Daniil's direction. Daniil reacted swiftly and swung with the shovel at the intruder, striking him directly in the face. The strike was powerful enough to cause the Russian soldier to drop his rifle and fall onto the ground. He was not out of his senses, however, and tried to get back up. Daniil swung with the shovel again, this time overhead, and forcefully brought it down on the soldier's head. In the heat of the moment, he did not want to leave things to chance, so he picked up the intruder's rifle and without hesitance fired several shots at him. Harsh, air-bursting sounds of gunfire came, and the intruder was laying motionless on the floor, a puddle of blood beginning to form under him. Daniil continued breathing fast and hard, clutching onto the gun and aiming it at the Russian soldier's corpse, preparing to shoot in case the soldier got back up to continue hurting him or his sister. Half a minute passed. Daniil continued staring. The corpse continued laying still. Daniil dropped the gun and fell to his knees, still in shock. He looked over towards his sister to see if she was fine. She was sitting on the floor, shifting her shocked eyes from the soldier's corpse to Daniil and then back, utter terror on her face. "He's dead," Daniil murmured finally. "I killed the bastard." Lara crawled over to her brother's side and grabbed him by the right arm. She was shaken and needed some comfort. Daniil couldn't get a hold of himself either. The sense of alarm inside of him persisted, and he kept thinking that another soldier would enter the shelter at any moment now. Lara continued holding onto his arm and squeezing it hard. Her forehead was resting on his shoulder, and he could hear her sobbing. He brought his other arm around her and gave her a hug. He never killed anyone before, not until now. It was still hard to accept that he had just murdered another person, but he did not feel guilty. He knew there was no other way. Had he not killed this man, the man would have killed him and his sister. It was kill or be killed. "We should go to another shelter," Daniil said after a couple more minutes. "It's no longer safe in this one."